the Mediterranean. And I'm going to talk about that today. So let me go forward with a couple of background outside. I have been working on a book. I'm trying to get my screen to punch forward here. I'd like to change a slide. Just give me a moment. Okay. Okay, so in terms of background, some of you may have been to Malta and in the Baracca Gardens up at the top of the city of Valletta, straight down through the rock were the headquarters for the Allied command during World War II at the time of setting the stage for going into Operation Husky into Sicily. And Churchill was there, and something that I think is appropriate for this institute and most everywhere that thinks that history is important to understanding the present. Churchill, one of his sayings was, the longer you can look back, the further you can look forward. So I'm just in the process. I finished writing a book, and it'll be out in October, that is called Great Power Clashes Along the Maritime Silk Road, Lessons from History to Shape Current Strategy. So one of the case studies in that book is actually about the rise and the stall of the Ottoman Navy during the 16th century. So Eric Goldstein, who's been somebody who's talked here, is a student of great power relations in the Eastern Mediterranean especially. And I actually audited his class on that in order to make my understanding of the region more systematic a couple of years ago. And it was a good background for this work that I did. So here's a series of flags of the Ottoman Empire, plus the 5 different parties that were part of the Holy League during that period. So we see that during that period of the 1520s through the 1560s, 1570s, the Battle of Otranto, Battle of Preveza before that in 1538, that you have not only the Papal States, but also the Knights that were on Malta at the time. They'd been forced from Rhodes several years earlier, and Genoa and Venice and the Habsburgs from Spain. So this was the Holy League that went together against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. So this is great power struggle there. If we come back up to the current era, we have, again, a great series of powers that are involved, whether it's the EU or the United States or Russia or Turkey and Britain, France and Germany are also involved as smaller powers than these larger powers. But China is really the new kid on the block who's come in, and that's become my concern. Is this going to be a presence that has longevity in the region? And so I began looking at this a number of years ago, including most significantly in Greece, when I became aware of Chinese involvement in the port of Piraeus in 2009 and began traveling there over the last decade. So let's go on to talk about Piraeus. And here on the left is an article which I wrote that has a number of observations that I'm going to make today: China's emergence as a power in the Mediterranean, port diplomacy, and active engagement. And I'll talk about each of these aspects of China's involvement, about port diplomacy and active engagement. But the picture in the middle at the top is, of course, President Xi Jinping of China and the Prime Minister of Greece, Mitsotakis. And this is a picture that was taken in 2019 in November, and when Xi came to Greece. And the background are the cranes in the Piraeus. These are Chinese cranes that are loading and unloading the ships that are coming into the port. Now below that and to the right are the island directly opposite the port itself. And you can see the Greeks who had fought and memorialized here in 480 BC in the Great Battle of Salamis, that their spear and their bow are pointed directly at those cargo cranes across the bay. You can barely see it in the photo on the right. But the fact that there has been this great power involvement for 2,500 years anyway, as part of the history of this region. Here, to put us, give us an idea in space on the map on the left, an aerial photography. We see the island of Salamis, and then off to the right, you see the coast of Piraeus, and then there's a blow up of it to the right in the map on the right. You can probably see where that fits on the map on the left. But schematically in the map on the right, we see the passenger port, which is the old lagoon, which is where the galleys had been left from Piraeus during the, for instance, the Peloponnesian Wars that were again 400 BC. And then around a bit to the west, what is the commercial port now of Piraeus. And there are three great terminals there. The big block coming down and the small one beside it are terminals 2 and 3. And immediately to the right of that was terminal 1. And off to the west of that is Parma, which is currently not under Chinese control, is still more an area of smaller shipping and ship repair, and that is very active at this point as well. In terms of European conception of how the Chinese might approach Europe, that the look from 1970s, when before Mao died in 1976, there was a film that was released called The Chinese in Paris, La Chinois à Paris. And the idea was if the Chinese were to come, they would come with Mao hats and they would come with a little red book. And that would be the great presence of China in Europe. But now, from 30 years on to 50 years on, we have the figure of somebody who's actually appeared as a Chinese, who's a power player in Europe. And in this case, Captain Fu Chengchui, who is the director of COSCO, the Chinese overseas shipping company in Piraeus, and a very important position for both COSCO and for the Chinese. And the photograph below is one I took from up on the hillside over the cranes, looking out over the island of Salamis. And interestingly enough, this was in 2019 in October, so it's just about a month before she visited the port itself. And as we talked to longshoremen about the Chinese presence and what they thought of it, because I had read quite a bit about and talked with people about the labor unrest in Greece as a reaction to the Chinese coming and offering competition to Greek labor in the ports. By this time, which is of course, well over a decade after the Chinese became involved, that the longshoreman, when asked whether he thought it was a good thing or a bad thing, and whether the Chinese should continue their development of the port, he thought it was a very good thing because there would be action within the next month as opposed to the next century if he left it to the mayor of Piraeus. So I didn't expect that kind of response, and it's anecdotal, but it indicated to me that at least there is some support for the idea of Chinese involvement in Piraeus. Now, Piraeus is seen as one of the important case studies within what China calls its Belt and Road Initiative. And this was the initiative that Xi Jinping announced in 2013. So we're just coming up to 10 years in 2023 for the practice, this Belt and Road Initiative, where China has tried to establish connectivity across Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, even into the Gulf and the Middle Eastern part of West Asia. But then significantly in Africa, there's been a great deal of involvement, and also in Latin America. And in Europe, the most important early movement of this Belt and Road was to actually translate the early activity in Piraeus into labeling it as a Belt and Road program. But of course, the Belt and Road started in 2013, about 4 years after there was initial Chinese involvement. But China, I think we can see the Belt and Road Initiative as the great geo-economic impetus of China, signature foreign policy of Chinese President Xi Jinping. I think unlikely to go away now that he's been extended to a third term and maybe a fourth term. Because he's felt that China could play a role in not only expanding its footprint and presence worldwide, but also in working out relationships that are positive with countries in all these regions that I've mentioned. So here, just to give some photos that I've taken while I've been there, you can see the cranes. You can see the COSCO shipping. COSCO is the major SOE, the major state-owned enterprise that China is exercising its power through in the Mediterranean area. COSCO is very active in many other ports around the world as well. A very large player in China's maritime affairs. This is the passenger port, which of course looks quite different from the container port. And we see Minoan lines. It's perhaps the largest commercial passenger port in the Mediterranean, and I think in Europe as a whole. In the bottom right, there's a tall ship, and I actually sailed on that tall ship out from Piraeus over to Monemvasia in the Peloponnese, and then around to the Bay of Navarino, where Pylos during the Peloponnesian War was a very important place where the Greek admiral captured 280 Spartans and held them hostage, probably the most humiliating defeat for the Spartans in their history. But in any event, to travel from Piraeus was a great treat for me, and to do it in the ship. Interestingly, in Navarino, I arrived there on October 20th in 2017, so it was exactly 190 years after the defeat of the Turks in the Ottomans, who were defeated by not only the Greek Navy, but with the Greek partners at that time, who were the British, the French, and the Russians. And on that day when I was there in 2017, there was a Russian warship along with a Greek warship there, and the Greek and Russian sailors were having a celebratory lunch on the shore. So these relationships go back a long time in terms of great power relations. So let's take a look here at a little bit about the growth of the port of Piraeus. In 2009, when the Chinese first became involved, they took a lease on those terminals 2 and 3 in the container port. They had no interest in the passenger port, and Greece operated Terminal 1 in the container port. And they were moving less than 1 million TEUs, that is to say, 20-foot equivalent units. So these are metal containers that are 20 feet long. So this is the standard unit of measure for volume of how many units various container ports really all around the world can handle. You want to compare where they are in rankings on the world scale, you would do it in the TEU measure. So the big, what happened from between this 2009 and 2016 is that the Chinese side of the port grew leaps and bounds compared to the Greek side of the port, which was moved much more slowly. And then in 2016, as Greece was willing to privatize the port, the Chinese actually bought 51% of the shares in the Port of Piraeus Authority, so that they then had a controlling share, had a majority share in the stock of the port at that point, and they had an option to buy another 16% by 2020, which they subsequently have done. So they actually own directly outright 2/3 of the Port of Piraeus and its operations in terms of how it's run. So you can see between 2009, when Piraeus was ranked 116th place worldwide, that by 2016, it had moved up to 38th place worldwide. Now, I don't have, because I did this work 3 years ago, I don't have the pandemic statistics in an organized fashion, but I have checked various reports and so forth. So by 2020, Piraeus, in fact, had moved up to number 28, so it had moved up another 10 places, even up coming into the beginning of the pandemic. During the pandemic period itself, from 2020 to 2023, China had targeted growth to go over 6 million TEUs, it has still not achieved that. That in fact there was a regression during the period of the pandemic, that the overall volume of trade slowed down, and I think we're all aware of that. That the world trade did take a dive during the pandemic, and for reasons of safety, but also for reasons of supply chain and not being able to actually get the product to ship and so forth. But the 2021, the TEUs handled. So the brief statistics right now is that Piraeus has actually become, according to most estimates, the largest port in the Mediterranean. But before I actually show those statistics, I'm just going to say, why Piraeus? Why is China interested in that? It refers to the port of Piraeus. China does, or has in some of its literature, as the dragon's head of Chinese influence in Europe. And what does that mean? Well, it means it's a port, a bridgehead, where the Chinese can contemplate a larger operation. But what do they really want to do with this? The great ports are in the north in Europe, not in the Mediterranean. But it's really for a struggle over that access to the market in Central and Eastern Europe. And that the route to Piraeus is quite a bit shorter than to Rotterdam. And so if a hub, if Piraeus, often spoken of as a hub in the Chinese literature, can become a hub that can transport those goods somehow up through the Balkan countries and into Hungary and beyond, then it's going to be able to have an ability to really operate in that market in a more penetrating way than not having that. Now, the problem right now is that this connectivity is not firmly in place. In other words, the railroads and the roads that go up through North Macedonia or up through Serbia, or the railway between Serbia and Hungary are all problematic. The idea of having transit ports along the Adriatic course, like the coast, like the port of Bar, which you see in the map in the middle here. The idea of this connectivity goes back, to early German attempts and to the Oriental Express. Very important for linking Central Europe but to Western Europe, and then to the Middle East and to Asia. So this is not really a new idea, this idea of connectivity, but it is the 21st century idea in practice that we're looking at right now. On the right is a highway that I had a chance to take a look at the Chinese building when I was there in 2019, because I was on the railway that paralleled the highway, and a very, very controversial project. And maybe Ambassador Vesko Garcevic, who's spoken here, may have mentioned this particular railway. And I won't dwell on that right now, but it's just opened parts of it in the last couple of months, about 2.5 years behind initial projections. But Chinese still are involved there. And the future of China's involvement in Greece, in the Balkans, is something that we'll talk about more as we go forward here. So going back to the ports, if we want to understand where Piraeus fits into the situation, this is a chart from 2017 I prepared from several years ago. And you can see here that Piraeus had moved from, what we're looking at from being totally off the scale of the top 10. By 2017 was ranked number 7. There were 2 ports, Valencia and Algeciras, in the Mediterranean, that were larger than Piraeus. And then the biggest 4 ports in Europe were Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, and Bremerhaven, all Northern European ports. And then Piraeus at that point had passed Felixstowe in the UK, Marseillais in Malta, and Barcelona in Spain. So the growth in red is Piraeus, and you look over at the figure on the right, that its growth in the decade between 2007 and 2017 had been almost 200%, much higher than any other port in Europe at the time. And although Valencia had grown a lot, and Algeciras more than any of the Northern European ports. So then if you jump down to the bottom, you see the 5-year growth of the 5 Northern European ports at 14%, and the growth of the 5 Mediterranean ports at 72%. So you see that there's a kind of balancing that's been going on in the growth of the ability of the ports to handle volume between the north and the south, and the south is becoming more of a player than it had been previously. Here's a couple of maps just to give you an idea of major ports on the left, both in the north and then in the Mediterranean. There's a clue of where all of this traffic is coming from through the Suez Canal. The dotted line down in the southeast corner of the map comes up into, and this is one of the great strengths of Piraeus, as it is almost beyond Egypt, is almost the first possible port of call into the Mediterranean. So it's a logical place for the Chinese to target to have a hub in the Mediterranean. It's almost 3,000 miles, maybe over 3,000 miles from Piraeus around through Gibraltar up to Rotterdam, for instance. So it cuts the route from China into a much shorter route into, for instance, Central and Eastern Europe, as we've talked about. And now the ones on the left, China does not have investment in all of those, the 10 largest container ports. But on the right, this was a map just to show 14 ports that actually had Chinese investment in it. So they're very active, about even-handedly, in the Mediterranean and in the northern ports of Europe on the North Sea. Now, on the last map, you saw that there was a possibility of another way to come around to Rotterdam from China, and that is the Northern Sea route, that is to say, the Arctic route that comes around. So if you can make out what this map is, the red at the bottom route is actually the route that comes through the Suez Canal. So the routes all start in China, in Shanghai. So it's about 8,000 miles to Piraeus. At 10 knots, that is about 30 days to get around whereas to go around the extra 3,000 miles to get to Rotterdam is about 43 days. So it's almost 2 weeks longer to get to Rotterdam than it is to get to Piraeus through that southern route through the Indian Ocean. Now, if you look at the Northern Sea route, which is the one in pink or in coral, that in fact is shorter than the route from Shanghai to Piraeus. So it's instead of being 9,000 miles, it's about 8,000 miles or 8,300 miles, something like that. And then the Northwest Passage, which is the route in yellow, is about 200 miles longer than that. So depending on whether or not you want to deal with skirting Russia, or whether you want to deal with skirting Canada, what the sea and ice conditions are at a particular time. So when we had a panel at Boston University 18 months ago, and there was an expert on the Arctic there, their calculation was that there was about 2% of the world's trade that was going between China and Europe was going through the Northern Sea route. And so that meant that it was almost insignificant at the present time, 2 years ago. But the possibility with global warming and the continual opening of the Northern Sea route, this could become a factor going into the future. So I thought I'd mention it here today. In the article that I showed you, and I'm happy if you're interested in taking a look at that, I'll have my email up on the screen later, and I'll be happy to email you a PDF copy of that article if you're interested in it. But in that, I identified about 30 ports where there was Chinese activity of various kinds, Mediterranean ports, where the Chinese were actively involved. So this is when I talk about this idea of port diplomacy, that China has made a concerted effort to try to reach out for multi-possibilities. Now, I'll just point out that this Belt and Road Initiative is quite a fragmented operation from the Chinese side. This is not a Chinese grand strategy for controlling trade around the world, because not only are SOEs, state-owned enterprises like Costco involved, but also there are provincial government organizations. There are many private organizations that are port companies and shipping companies, that they compete with each other on the Chinese side. So they may think that they have a leg up because of it could be even personal connections with the port in the Adriatic, like Rijeka, for instance, and which happened with the Ningbo Port Authority, which was a private organization. And but anyway, these red dots on this map actually shows that there is and the article that I put together actually describes in summary fashion the nature of Chinese involvement in each of these places. So I just decided I'd begin to cast my eyeball over, what is going on in the region from the Chinese perspective, maritime perspective. I'm primarily a maritime historian, so these are the things that rivet me. In Greece, there are other ports that are significant aside from Piraeus, and I just thought I'd mention that the Chinese are not really involved, although they've tried to get involved, for instance, in Thessaloniki, but really it was European and Russian money that was accepted there rather than Chinese. And when Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, was here, really just at the time in 2019, when President Xi was in Greece, that he negotiated some arrangements at Alexandropoli regarding the end of a pipeline that would cross over into Bulgaria. And then the U.S. and NATO are very interested in the Suda port on Crete, and so that they have some presence there. So this is just to give a little bit of perspective that Greece is leaving the door open for other players to be involved. This great power interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, this bigger theme that we're considering today. We can see that there are great powers aside from China who are involved in the areas. I just thought I'd talk of all the other ports. I just mentioned some of these in the Adriatic because I see that these are the possible alternatives to Bar, for instance, Durrës in Albania. So far, the Chinese have invested only in the airport there and not in the port. Zadar, Rijeka are in Croatia, and Koper in Slovenia. And Ningbo, again, the Port Authority is involved there. So Costco, you can see, it gives you a little bit of an idea that there are a variety of players and a variety of nearby interests as really subnodes on this route from the maritime side. I think Rijeka right now probably has the best train connection directly from the port going up to Budapest. So that, I would say, has taken a bit of a jump forward and a lead right now. Now, I don't want to go through this without actually talking for a moment or two about the 16+1. And this is the platform that China established in 2012 with 16 different countries. And you can see the map. So they're contiguous all the way from Estonia in the north, and that was all the way down to Albania in the south. And then in 2019, Greece actually joined, they went to the summit, which is in Dubrovnik in Croatia. And the previous prime minister from the Syriza party in Greece was there attending and actually said that, yes, Greece was willing to become a member of the 16+1. It became 17+1 fairly briefly because it wasn't too long after that when Lithuania withdrew. So it's back to 16+1. But during the pandemic, it's gone very slow, and everything that China promised has not happened because there just hasn't been the level of economic activity. It's not only because of that, but that is one reason why things have slowed considerably. But anyway, here's those list of countries, and here's a picture of Prime Minister Tsipras at Dubrovnik at what became then the 17+1 rather than the 16+1 in April of 2019. So Greece still has that connection, whatever legs, and of course not only the pandemic, but also the war in Ukraine is having a great impetus to rethink the nature of all relations throughout the world, but I think especially that everyone, the leaders of the countries in this part of the world, in the Balkans, are very concerned about how they should play going forward. Should they move closer to the United States what is Europe going to do? Is it going to actually have an independent foreign policy, or is it going to be quite united with the U.S. perspective? Regarding Ukraine, there has been a substantial amount of overlapping interest in an 80% Venn diagram where they work very closely together. But going forward, it's not certain exactly how that will play out. So in wrapping up, I'll just show some slides with a few notes, and maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion as well after that. So since later in 2019, when Syriza lost power and Tsipras went out of office, replaced by Mitsotakis, things seem to have moved a bit closer to the United States in that period. Yet those agreements that were agreed in that photo that I showed you earlier between Xi and Mitsotakis in 2019, there were over a dozen agreements that were written up, and most of those have come into some form of implementation subsequently. So Greece has not necessarily turned its back on China. There could be changes coming up in the Greek elections, possibly in May of this year. The Mitsotakis government has been weakened by some recent developments. Piraeus's performance during the pandemic has been very good, certainly competitive with most other European ports, but hasn't been off the charts as it was formerly. My question is, will Greek views on China remain rather sympathetic as an economic option vis-a-vis tie into Brussels and European practices? So they've played the China card, I think, quite effectively over the last a few years. We don't know how that's going to play out. Remains to be seen. A big development in 2019 was that Italy signed one of the BRI MOUs, Memoranda of Understanding. So in this, there was specifics about the ports of Genoa and Trieste. So, a great port at the north of the Adriatic, and another one, right in the middle of the soft underbelly of Europe. Maybe with even a better route into central into the Western powers, with Genoa. So a very interesting development. The Chinese communications company, import company, was involved in that. They signed those agreements. Palermo and Ravenna were both mentioned as potential ports. Palermo in Sicily and Ravenna in the Adriatic. But there hasn't been much action since the pandemic took hold and so forth. So, but it's something that I would say is Greece's strongest competition. So we have to look at what China wants to do. We have, the interests of each of the countries. What they're going to act in their own interest going forward. How is this going to play out? What deals are they willing to make? Is Italy going to be closer to the Brussels position than Greece is going to be in the medium-term future? All remains to be seen. So I've mentioned this relations between China and Russia being a very important part of how things will happen going forward. As China moves closer to Russia, will Europe, including Greece, move further away from China? And it seems like it's likely that might happen, but we'll see going forward. So just a couple of notes to follow up on this theme. I see China as an emerging great power in Europe and contesting power in Southeastern Europe, especially as great powers have done. There's more of an opportunity for them there than there is, just as the great powers always have worked with these smaller powers in Southeastern Europe to control and treat as vassals or as allies. That China is, a much more substantial economy than Russia is. So I could see that over time, Russia's place could be replaced in many instances by China in Europe. China's geostrategy in Europe prioritizes economics. So the BRI is fundamentally a geoeconomic exercise, although it does have significant geopolitical and geostrategic aspects. And but the BRI is the current geoeconomic tool that China is using for working the area. Although I think we have to keep in mind that this is just the current iteration what has been probably a 3-decade-long interest of China in programs of globalization, such as the Western Development Program, where China goes global, and these are sort of congealed together into a more coherent form in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. So are these what we're looking at? Smiles of comedy or frowns of tragedy? Is the BRI a golden goose or a beast of burden, a gift horse or a Trojan horse? Is it a development opportunity, or is it a source of debt traps? Will promises be fulfilled, or will perils be encountered in terms of involvement of Greece and other countries in the region in working with China? So we're at BU, we're going to have a conference at the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the Belt and Road Initiative. And it'll be in October, which will be exactly 10 years since Xi Jinping announced the Maritime Silk Road in Indonesia. It'll be probably a day and a half. And I ran during the pandemic a series of 15 sessions with scholars. That was a remote program in various aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you're interested in that, again, you could just jot me an email and I'll send you a link and you can follow up on that. So those are my comments, and I don't know if you want to discuss any of these questions, but I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rhode, for a very enlightening presentation, and a fruitful kind of like a presentation as far as the discussions. Because I have to say that some of those pictures are very familiar to me, because I grew up in the port of Piraeus as a young boy, and I know the area fairly well. And
I envy you.
I remember Sundays in Salamis, but I had no conception of the Battle of Salamis until later on. That we met like an outing there. But my questions have to do with your last slides, and the perception that we have of China. So you sort of like you allude to the fact that China is an up and coming power, and as an up and coming power, it's doing certain things. And even what's going on in Greece right now, that horrific accident that took place about a month ago that had to do with the rail lines in Greece. And it was very, very controversial, because eventually the company that bought the rail lines in Greece was the Italian national company, rather than the Chinese stepping in and buying it. And I know that the rail connection was a big part of it. So how much of what we're seeing of China in the region is creating perceptions and misperceptions about China, and not the willingness to welcome China as a partner, but rather just predisposed to see him as an antagonist, which is really pushing the Europeans to make all kinds of short-sighted decisions, like the privatization of that rail line to the Italians rather than to go to Chinese hands.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. The rail question itself is a huge one, because freight by land is worldwide is largely a rail issue, sometimes a truck issue, but more importantly, a rail issue. And I was a little surprised when that happened, and the Italians were able to buy the train system and to operate that. But the Italians have had good engineering in the past, and it didn't seem that it was going to fail, from my perspective in the short term. And I don't know enough about the Larissa crash to know how much of that was pre-existing conditions or of the rail itself, and or whether or not it was the electronics that failed. And you may know more about the details on that than I do. But the overall, China has more HSR, more high-speed rail, bullet trains than the rest of the world combined. And how did that happen? they learned from the Japanese, the Shinkansen, which is very successful. And I got on the platform in Tokyo, going to Kobe, and I got on at 3 minutes to the hour. The train was on the hour. I thought, oh, this is on time. And the train ended up flying right by Kobe and went all the way to Hiroshima because I was 3 minutes early for the train I was supposed to be on. So the efficiencies of the system were quite profound in Japan. And a somewhat related anecdote about competition is that in the great competition for building the Indonesian rail line from Jakarta to Yogyakarta, that the Japanese and the Chinese competed head to head on that. And the Japanese was more expensive and took longer to build. So the attractions of price and early use was very attractive to the Japanese, to the Indonesians, and they commissioned the Chinese. But the data shows that that over time, the cost of operation of Japanese train lines is less. In other words, it's like buying a more sophisticatedly engineered car, that it's going to last longer than one that is not as sophisticated. So the consumers, countries that are especially developing countries, have to make these choices. And initially high purchase price is a difficult one to overcome. But I just thought I'd talk a little bit about trains outside of Europe. The biggest one of the individual projects that was part of this so-called 17+1 series of agreements was the Belgrade to Budapest railway, and the Chinese started talking about this in about 2014. So it's almost a decade now, and eventually they decided to push ahead with it. But the Hungarians have not started any of that. And why is that? Well, Hungary is an EU country, and there is a regulation that EU countries are supposed to have competitive tenders. And so that in Serbia, the train line has been started from Belgrade because it didn't have to go through this tender process. They actually hired the Chinese company to do it, and took a loan from China to pay the Chinese company, which is a fairly standard formula for many of the Belt and Road Initiative projects. How this works out, and I don't know what your feeling is about Piraeus, if it's basically been overall a net positive for Greece. My talking with people, and what I see is a reduced amount of animosity towards China, which may be changing again now, especially in the wake of the Ukraine war, and where China is going at this stage, and its closer partnership with Russia. Whether or not these are factors that are going to influence the medium-term future.
Yeah. I think there was a great deal of hesitation prior to 2009, and then the way that the whole sale went through after 2009 and the economic crisis. And I think, to the point of the accident in Tempe the last month or so, it wasn't necessarily just what happened in the station master and all those other things. I think what bubbled to the surface as far as the Italian involvement was how that came about, the price by which the Italian national government was able to procure this, even though it was framed as a privatization push on the part of the Troika at the time. The Italians were able to purchase it for 45 million euros when it was assessed at 300 million, and then the Greek state is supposed to give back 50 million a year for a decade for infrastructure upkeep. So in a sense, the Greek state pays 750 million, the Italian state buys it for 45 million. So people question that aspect of it, not necessarily just the accident. It's just like the accident really shed a lot of light into that process and how those decisions are being made. About a decade ago, I run a program every summer with students, and about a decade ago, we visit Suda Bay, and one of my students, one of my undergraduate students, asked the U.S. commander on Suda Bay whether he thought that the Chinese presence in the region was a threat to American interest. And I thought at the time that the student was sort of like overstepping because it was more like of a commercial link. And actually, the American commander said yes, they view it as a sort of like a threat on the horizon kind of a thing. And it seems by the policies of the last few years, and I think you very accurately mentioned it when you mentioned the ports of Alexandroupoli and Thessaloniki and Suda, that this is sort of like it's not just China's Belt and Road initiative, but this is something bigger than that, or the perception of it is something bigger than that. That this is sort of like inroads in Europe, or is more of a challenge in European kind of a construct rather than just a commercial deal. So, but the local attitudes, I think they're a little softer because it's more of a job creation, but there's a great deal of resentment on the local level. But it is based on the 10 years of economic troubles in Greece. This is sort of like not in the forefront.
I'm quite struck by your description of the numbers involved in the train deal with Italy, and it reminds me of the discussion about the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which is the sort of poster child for the possibility of debt trap of the Chinese putting a weak player in a position of great debt and then taking back the port itself later on. So there's a great, I don't know how much publicity there's going to be about this Italy-Greece interaction over the trains, but it strikes me it's not going to become although the numbers are similar to Hambantota in terms of the amount of dollars or cash involved, that it has become a huge public relations disaster for the Chinese, and has caused them to rethink the nature of their financing and so forth in terms of the Belt and Road projects that they're doing. And I think that they are being more circumspect in some places than they were formerly as a result of that particular case. But you're talking now about something that's strictly a intra-European pair of states with Italy and Greece, and it probably won't get that much outside publicity. But anyway, any comments or questions from the floor? Do you mind if I go on to see?
No, yeah. There was a Jaco just posted something on the chat. You're welcome to read that. I mean, he's asking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact there. So,
okay, I let's see. I'm going to have to, I think, close my screen because I don't have access to the chat. Unless...
Yeah, I can actually read it to you. It's how does Russia's invasion of Ukraine impacted the relationship between China and Russia with the emergence of China's economic political strategy within the EU. You talked about the potential switch between Russia and China as the dominant political power of the East. How has the war in Ukraine affected the existing relationship?
Well, this is a very complex question, and China has not, I think, become a direct ally of Russia, but has certainly moved close, and especially during the Olympics, before the invasion. But China will act in its own interest, I think, going forward. But I think, what we're seeing in some ways from a theoretical perspective is a switch back to a consciousness more of what Halford Mackinder called the heartland kind of thesis. In other words, it's a continentally based area of control, which whoever controls the heart of the the land is going to control the world, is the way Mackinder put it. There is that possibility, but Russia is definitely the weaker economic partner right now. And China is in a very strong position to buy energy more cheaply from Russia at the current time. So it's strongly in China's interest. I think that vis-a-vis Europe, that China sees a possibility of peeling off Europe from the transatlantic alliance to some extent. And although at the moment I would say the transatlantic alliance is stronger now during the current American administration, which is much more sympathetic to European concerns. So it's increasingly difficult. But I think the Germans, German business sees that their future is going to be much more difficult if they don't maintain relations with China. This is a huge market for them. They're the biggest supplier of cars, high-end cars, to China from at least 3 of their manufacturers, all brands that I'm sure you know. And so in terms of that potential linkage and relationship with Europe, what I see is that the result of this war is that it's pushing the world more in a multipolar way. And what does that mean? It means that 15% of the world's population, that is to say Europe and the United States, support Ukraine in a very active way. Although there are other states that have voted against Russia's aggression in the global South, that 65 or 70% of the world's population, none of them are or very few of them are actually siding with the U.S./European position, supplying arms and so forth to Ukraine. That they're acting in what Jorge Heine, who's now teaching at Boston University, the former Chilean ambassador to China and to India, this so-called active non-alignment. So we're seeing that the middle economies are sitting on the sidelines because just like we're talking about the competition in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's almost as if the Eastern Mediterranean is kind of like a laboratory for this idea of conflicting great powers, because worldwide the global South is siding with whatever their best deal is for their own personal interests, politically and economically. And it's not necessarily based on democracy or autocracy, but it's more economic. But this is something that's a different shape from what we've seen in the past. I think it's probably potentially a wider and more profound movement than the non-aligned movement that began in Bandung in 1955. Russia and China are 2 of these great powers that can be separate poles, or they can be combined for a certain time as a unified pole, rather like Europe and America might be combined together. But I think that the effect of the war itself is resulting in a restructuring. So I would say that's the most profound impact of the war. We have a question here in the room.
Yeah, okay.
Okay,
Nope.
so
Good afternoon, Professor Rhode. It's nice to have you here. So this is touched on a little bit, but maybe you could expand some. The port of Piraeus, as you and Texas pointed to, has been, received by many who are directly involved in it, namely a worker in the port, as being overall a positive development. Has been brought up by Costco, but and perceptions like that, no doubt, have rippling effects across the Eastern Mediterranean. But at the same time, I think of cases, as you mentioned, like Florida, or move away from this shoreline a little bit, the the highway Montenegro, with which I am ambassador best, so the Archbishop worked a lot. Have you seen, cases like that, perhaps, all the various implications having a showing of time on the willingness of Mediterranean states, whether they're Greece, whether they're Italy, having, rethinking the prospect of the China. And inadvertently undoing Chinese ambition and this BRI.
Okay, well, that's a very good question. I would say my sense is that in the reading that the Greeks have not yet been chilled. I would say that the Montenegrins have been chilled. So that the responses have been different, and the impact of the projects have been very different, and as a result, the response has bin different. My sense is that Croatia is quite happy with the bridge that's been built from the Piraeus Peninsula across to connect the rest of the coast of Croatia without having to have traffic pass through Bosnia. That the port involvements in Croatia, I think, have been accepted well enough by the Croatians on the part of the Chinese. There are many projects, many of them for instance, in Serbia, in Macedonia. I would say power plant projects, coal projects, and hydropower projects. Steel projects, yes, and I think the Macedonian highway projects are regarded as a relative success. The first one is now open. The second one is scheduled to open again within a year or so. So my sense is as I think about these projects, I don't really think of these as being chilled at the moment. I think that on the power plants, I'm talking about the highway projects. On the power plant projects, I would say that that there is a great concern about the environmental impacts that are chilling. I mean, Xi Jinping has said that they're not going to do any more overseas coal-powered projects. We have yet to see how the implementation of that particular statement, going forward. But it did seem like an attempt by the Chinese to address a very important and major concern by the international community and their client states in terms of these Belt and Road Initiative projects. So I think it's overall a mixed bag. My own sense is that these large-scale infrastructure projects are probably not going to be the major thrust of the Belt and Road Initiative going forward. I think we're going to see more digital, lower investment. China's economy has taken a major hit during the pandemic. Already, the amount that they were investing in loaning had fallen before the pandemic, but it's done so even more rapidly since then. So it's going to be a matter, and in terms of the soft power, the smaller soft power projects, the Confucius Institutes overall have not received a good reception worldwide, and many of those campuses have closed over the last 5 years. So that was, I think, a major attempt to reach out and build bridges of communication that has had a fairly a more limited success over the last couple of years. So I think that from my perspective, one of the biggest problems is that the feasibility studies have never been of a high standard for the Belt and Road Initiative projects. If China decides that they can allow those to take place by third-party people and not be the vendors of those feasibility studies and then selling the projects, and they're willing to accept the results of those feasibility studies, and they can actually then still be competitive in terms of offering. that they will have something to offer, and that I think countries will respond favorably to those offerings. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, is that, I think that's all the questions here in the room right now. So I think that that's probably how we're going to wrap it up. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention and for the chance to share these thoughts with you and to have your responses. So thank you very much.